Hello, my name is Casey Barnes, and today I'm going to be explaining the article Suicide Terrorism as a Tool of Insurgency Campaigns, the Functions, Risk Factors, and Countermeasures. So we are going to be talking about suicide terrorism, and suicide attacks are offensive operations where success depends on the death of the perpetrator, and these are often represent the highest point of escalation towards a maximum level of destruction. So in this article, the authors hope to cover strategic objectives as well as operational advantages of suicide attacks in the context of asymmetric conflicts. And they also interpret several scientific hypotheses about the social political causes of suicide terrorism in terms of risk factors. So some of the strategic goals with the tactical and operational advantages include that suicide attacks, and they involve instrumental logic, and organizations will choose suicide attacks. They have to choose this method of terrorism from a variety of tactical options to achieve certain strategic, tactical, and operational goals. And the goals that are most associated with suicide attacks are the expulsion of foreign occupying forces, obtaining national independence, the destabilization or the replacement of a political regime, and the intensification of a violent conflict that's in progress, or an interruption of a process of peaceful solutions for a political, ethnic, or religious conflict. And all of these goals, it's really important to note, could be met. These goals could be pursued using conventional terrorist and insurgent methods, but suicide attacks are the chosen method to reach these goals for these advantages. That there's high lethality, they cause a lot more casualties and material damage than other methods, and there's a lot of intense psychological and social impact. Suicide attacks generate more anxiety, a sense of helplessness, fear, social disturbances, and they often always guarantee intensive media coverage. And these also facilitate access to certain well-protected and high-value political, military, or symbolic targets, and the simplification of these attacks and the risk reduction. Because in suicide attacks, there's no escape plan that's necessary, and there's no risk of them being captured because they're going to commit suicide. So risk factors that are associated with suicide attacks to make them more likely is what the author talks about next. And he talks about two different types of risk factors. And the first of that being risk factors related to tactical shifts. And these risk factors include the feeling of stagnation, crisis, or failure in the use of other insurgent methods, the coexistence of several insurgent groups who are pursuing equivalent goals, and the pre-existence of suicidal activity. So if a terrorist group has any of these, especially the pre-existence of suicidal activity in the group, they're more likely to choose this method. And then risk factors related specifically to the processes of polarization and radicalization are the dissemination of a subculture of martyrdom and the implementation of bloody counterinsurgent strategies and a higher contrast of identities between insurgents and their adversaries and targets. And so then the author goes to note that the success of suicide operations is dependent on several conditions, and these include a maximum level of secrecy, the ability of military to locate the enemy and their strategic features, obtaining materials and resources, and then acquisition of information about their target. And then the procedures for carrying out a suicide operation depends on the resources that are available, the level of damage that they intend, the identity of the target, and then the most common used method to carry out suicide attacks as of recent is suicide bombing, where they put on an explosive device on the person and they will detonate it when they are ready. And this has become really popular because it's cheap and it's easy to create, readily available in most places, and then it can cause a lot of damage. And then the author goes on to note two trends that are in suicide attacks that are not related to technology. And one of these being the implementation of suicide operations by small and isolated homegrown terrorist networks. And then the second one that he notes is that suicide attacks, as of recent, has begun to be carried out by women. And the motivations between these vary, but some of the big motivations for women carrying out suicide attacks are that the need for revenge, maybe the death of a family member, and a big one is the desire for them to prove their equality with male peers, and then the aspiration to escape the predestined life that's expected for them. So that's why oftentimes women will decide to carry out these suicide attacks for those motivations specifically. And then another new trend that the author noted was that some organizations have begun to use suicide bombings with people in profiles who are not typically seen as aggressive, like specifically using children or people who are mentally challenged. And these people are being used either because they will freely volunteer or they will unknowingly and unwittingly participate in these suicide operations. And so the author goes on to note that those are some new trends taking place in suicide operations. And then finally, the author finishes with measures to counter suicide attacks. And he talks about two different measures. He talks about defensive measures, which are measures that will try to keep the suicide bomber from reaching their target. And then he talks about offensive measures, which are measures that try to prevent or reduce the implementation of suicide attacks altogether. So the defensive measures that he mentions include physical barriers, the installation of cameras and surveillance systems, the implementation of roadblocks, border checkpoints, building perimeters, armoring light vehicles, using firearms to repel, the approach of car bombings, and all of that. These are all measures that are typically used to try and keep the suicide bomber from reaching his target. And then the author closes with the offensive measures, trying to prevent them from using suicide attacks altogether. They will use preemptive attacks against the groups that will promote suicide bombings that are known for suicide terrorist activity. They do this to reduce their capabilities and their resources. Some of these measures include destroying their training infrastructure, they're capturing their leaders or their militants, and a big one is cutting their source of funding. And then a second measure that's used is collecting intelligence about radical organizations. So the more information they gather, the better they're able to counter that. And then the last one is crucial, using any available resource to reduce the group's capabilities for recruitment. So if they can stop the recruitment process and stop people from joining this group and shut it down altogether, then they're more likely to prevent a suicide attack from happening. All right, so thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed the video.